Dawntrail is out, and with it comes a higher level cap, new abilities, and more challenges than ever before. For those level 100 White Mage players that are looking to better understand their job and how to play it effectively, test themselves in the 7.x extremes, savages, and ultimates, or even just get rid of healer anxiety so you can make your roulette queues quick and painless, this is the guide for you. I've been playing healer in this game for a decade with multiple expansions worth of world race experience, and I'm hoping that at some point during this guide there will at least be one or two things that you didn't already know. I'll cover your level 100 opener and DPS rotation, advice on how to heal effectively in all types of content, how to triage a group when things go wrong, and how to plan your healing and mitigation. There are chapters to allow for easy navigation because I know this is a bit of a long one on the whole, so please make liberal use of them if you need to. There will also be a lot of more experienced and active players that are only really interested in the opener and rotation sections, so I've put those at the start for that reason. Your goal as a healer is to 1. Keep the party alive, and 2. Deal as much damage as possible while doing so. In that order. Always. Whilst their mitigation to prevent damage to the raid isn't as extensive as their barrier healer counterparts, they have a very robust suite of GCD healing tools for various scenarios and regens to keep the raid healthy for an extended period of time. One thing to remember as a healer is that your job is not to immediately heal damage as soon as it comes out, but instead to take a proactive approach and look towards the next instance of damage and ensure that your party has enough HP to survive that before it comes along. As a regen healer, sometimes that means you'll be relying on your regen skills to slowly top the raid over time, rather than rushing to spam spells like Medica or Cure 3. Because of your powerful Afflatus abilities and healing buffs, your co-healer can often trust you to do the bulk of the burst healing, especially as it plays into the core flow of your job gauge. White Mage is the most accessible of the two pure healers in the game, focusing on brute force GCD healing that you can then convert directly back into burst DPS. Healers don't exactly have much of an in-depth or strict rotation to follow thanks to their relative simplicity, so usually their burst windows are very free-flowing and your main goals are just to keep GCD uptime and fit all of your heaviest hits within those buffs. Let's look at your level 100 openers real quick. Your opener is going to look a bit like this. You cast Glare pre-pull and then weave your new and improved potion into Dia, do another 2 filler DPS glares before hitting your Presence of Mind. You'll then hit your 3 Glare 4s anywhere within that buff window before resuming your normal filler attacks as before. As buffs are about to end, you will want to refresh your dots early to catch the end of them. In subsequent windows from the 2-minute buffs and onwards, you'll also want to get off an Afflatus Misery within this period of time. Basically, as long as you consistently get all 3 Glare 4s and a Misery under buffs, and ideally a dot refresh as well, without losing many ticks if you can get away with it, you've done it right. Bear in mind that you have a lot of leeway within those burst windows to actually use these hits. They are instant cast, meaning that after using them you have ample weave and movement space, making especially heavy mechanics much more manageable to deal with using them. If you delay these a couple of GCDs but still get them under buffs, and in exchange you make a mechanic easier for yourself, it is a very good idea to do so. I want to make a little note about the usage of Mind Gem Drafts, which are the Dawntrail iteration of potions for healers. Afflatus Misery is White Mage's strongest hit, and they cannot use it in the opener because you'll need to build it and spend 3 lilies in order to access it. This means that should you have prior knowledge of roughly how long a fight should be, and doing so will not lose you an overall possible extra gem draft usage, you should make it a goal to use your first potion at the 2-minute mark rather than pre-pull. Thanks to the improved reactivity of pressing a potion and the decreased animation lock that follows this time around, you can treat these consumables as you would any normal OGCD. So what's the logic behind this? Let's use an example. You know the boss fight is somewhere around the 8-minute and 45-second mark long, right? Well, that means that you only have time for 2 potions, and that you can use those 2 potions at the 2 and 8-minute mark safely, so you should. But instead, let's pretend there is a 7-minute fight. If you potion at the 2 minutes, then you will not have time to get that second tincture off, but if you instead use them on the pull and 6-minute mark, you can. You'll have 2 potions instead of 1, therefore you go for the 2. If you aren't 100% sure on these timings, you can always play it safe and just use the first one on pull. White Mage's DPS rotation is incredibly simple at its core. Your standard rotation will consist of refreshing your damage over time ability every 30 seconds, and in between you'll use your filler DPS skill. Every 20 seconds you gain a healing lily that caps out at 3. In general gameplay, you aim to avoid overcap, as using 3 healing lilies gives you your damaging afflatus misery, which refunds you the damage lost from those healing skills. I'll explain that in a little more depth a bit later in the video. You also have access to Presence of Mind and the glare fours that result from it that you'll use mostly on cooldown for added damage. Your aim is to always be casting, be it damaging spells or required heals, even during mechanics, using your instants as necessary to facilitate this. White Mage's healing and damage economy are pretty interlinked because of this, as you'll be using your 3 lilies per minute to do the vast majority of your GCD healing in encounters, and then timing your Blood Lily for movement or raid buffs to maximize its DPS potential. Dia is your dot, lasting for 30 seconds. In general, you want to apply it immediately as an encounter begins and reapply it as it's just about to drop, preferably when it has between 0 and 2 seconds remaining. It is instant cast, so you can use it in order to double weave and to make an extended free movement. If an enemy is about to die or become untargetable in the near future, bear in mind that the dot needs to be active for 12 or more seconds in order to be a damage gain over just using glare. As mentioned, you do an early refresh in Dawntrail to catch the end of 2-minute raid buffs. You'll only be early refreshing the first time this happens after each period of downtime. After that, it should just naturally line up from there on out. In between that, you'll use Glare 3. It has a base 1.5 second cast time, meaning you can single weave an instant afterwards and make a small 1 second movement for free. Assise is honestly one of your most useful skills, being a boon on both AoE and single target scenarios for both damage and healing. This ability is on a 40-second cooldown. In general, you want to use it immediately when it's available, as every third Assise will line up with the raid's 2-minute buffs, gaining even more value. I just want to make a note that Assise is considered primarily a DPS cooldown, and you also aim to double dip and gain value from its healing potential as well. Use Presence of Mind on cooldown, preferably as raid buffs are coming up, and use the 3 resulting glare fours within them for big damage and free movement. You will get 1 afflatus misery per minute. The even minute ones, 2, 4, 6 and so on, you'll want to make sure you hit under raid buffs, but the odd minute ones have a lot more leniency. As long as you aren't letting your healing lilies overcap or be used whilst you have a fully bloomed blood lily, you can hold on to it for the moment in which you need to move, or maybe when an AoE scenario appears, giving you even more of a win. Holy is your filler AoE DPS skill. It is a gain at 3 or more targets, and in those situations you will use it instead of glare. It is a 2.5 second base cast time, so in order to move in between holies, you need to slide cast. There are also some fringe cases where you can use it in single target scenarios. There are actually 2 scenarios in which Holy can be a gain on single target. Firstly, is directly as downtime is about to end. If you pre-cast Holy right before the boss returns, having the cast end the split second as the enemy becomes targetable, you're going to hit them for a free 150 potency. You then go back to doing your standard rotation of dotting and into glare immediately. Doing this effectively is pretty timing intensive and takes practice, so don't worry about it too much for the most part, it's just a cool little thing to bear in mind. The second situation is when a mechanic that requires a specific player facing happens, such as a gaze mechanic or like the monitor mechanic in the Omega Protocol. If you do not have a swift cast or extremely confident timing in order to cover the snapshot of this mechanic, Holy does not turn your player character, so you can position correctly and do a Holy. You still lose damage in comparison to the riskier option of glaring, but it's better than doing nothing, and it's a lot safer if you're not confident. Lucid Dreaming is a key part of your kit, and you should make sure you press it early and often. I usually use Lucid somewhere around the end of my opener, and then on cooldown from that point onwards unless I'm basically capped out on MP. Keeping a healthy mana economy is really important, and you should do something similar. Lastly, you have auto attacks. It's free damage, but in Dawntrail the auto attacks from a White Mage are capped out at 1 damage per hit. So really, it's a meme micro-optimization that in the grand scheme of things does not really matter for this job. You can do it if you want to, and it can be a good habit to get into for jobs that auto a little harder like Scholar, but it is not important on White Mage. Remember that on healers you need to manually turn on auto attacks each time you move back into melee range after disconnecting. It's probably worth going back to Caster 101 to discuss weaving really quickly, just in case, before we move a little more in depth. You can just skip this section, because I assume a lot of players will already know this. When you press a button marked as a spell on Disciples of Magic, you'll see it and all the other spells spin on your hotbar. This is the global cooldown, or GCD. The base GCD time in FF14 is 2.5 seconds. Whilst your GCD is rolling, you cannot use another until it finishes spinning. Anything marked as an ability does not cause your GCD to roll upon using it, meaning it is off the global cooldown and is referred to as an OGCD. As long as you aren't currently casting or animation locked, you can use an OGCD regardless of if your GCD is still rolling or not. This is called weaving. After using a spell, which is an instant cast, like Glare 4 or Misery, you can weave up to 2 OGCDs afterwards. You can technically do 3, but it's kind of ping reliant, so I wouldn't rely on it for most players. You can do your GCD, then press 2 buttons like Tetragrammaton or Divine Benison, and they both go off before my GCD has finished spinning and is ready to go again. And I can continue to press the next one without any delay. When it comes to casted spells, like say let's look at Glare as an example, so when you look at the tooltip, Glare 3 is listed as having a 1.5 second base cast, but a 2.5 second recast. This means that the GCD is 2.5, but the cast is 1.5. As a result of that, after your cast is finished, you then have a 1 second window to use an OGCD, move, or anything else you like before you aim to press your next GCD. As a note, your base cast and recast are both affected by the spell speed stat, so that's why yours may look a little bit different. If you need to do healing GCDs, that's absolutely fine, they just replace a glare, and if you need to do instant OGCD healing abilities such as Benediction or Tetra, you should aim to weave them without any clipping. By this point, you definitely know the basics of how the Lily gauge works, but we're going to go a little more in detail after covering our bases and look into smart management of your lilies and how to determine when to and whether to Misery. Every 20 seconds, you generate a healing lily on your gauge to a maximum of 3. Every time you spend a healing lily on Rapture or Solace, you will enrich the blood lily. After you've enriched it 3 times, it will bloom and you can use Misery. It requires you to charge 3 healing lilies to make it available, and then the spell itself is an instant GCD cast. As a result, preparing it will cost you 1320 potency, whilst casting it does 1320 potency. It's DPS neutral, kind of. This means that you need to be in combat for a minute per Misery prepped. Your Afflatus Rapture especially is incredibly strong as a party healing tool, especially when you consider that Plenary Indulgence is basically built to be paired with it. These heals being for all intents and purposes free to use is a huge part of White Mage's core strength as a job. You get these big, strong, instant cast heals every 20 seconds that you can buff in multiple ways, using them to move, triage, and work towards your big Misery hit. Whilst technically it's equal damage to just not use them at all, it kind of isn't once you factor in critical hits. It's true that most of your glares could crit and your Misery could not, resulting in those glares ending up stronger, but a single Misery critting has a higher chance of occurring than that, and when you factor in the value of hitting Afflatus Misery critting under raid buffs, you can gain absolutely insane value from it and hit incredibly high single hit damage numbers. And Misery under raid buffs is your goal because of this. You're essentially spending 3 unbuffed GCDs, and then 1 buffed GCD to do 4 buffed GCDs of damage all at once. It's just a pure win-win. If the enemies leave the field, which can often happen in the game's myriad trial or raid encounters, you can generate your lilies during downtime for an even greater gain. In fact, in dungeons, I often don't use my healing lilies at all during trash packs unless absolutely necessary. Usually your OGCDs are enough to protect a tank unless the pull lasts an extremely long time. Then during the run to the next pack, I spend the lilies generated to prep a Misery for the next group. This exact concept can be applied to 8-man content as well. Every bit of progress you make towards a Misery during downtime exponentially increases how much damage you are gaining when you use that Misery. So make use of this whenever you can. Whenever you know there is incoming downtime in an encounter, Try and stockpile lilies without overcapping and use them when the boss is away. Additionally, when the fight is close to ending, you want to ensure that you have no partially capped blood lily. If you see that a boss is low on HP, you need to make a decision on whether you can rush to cap and use a blood lily before it dies, or whether to instead stay on 0 stacks until the end of the encounter. Anything else results in a damage loss. We've talked a lot about damage, so let's pivot and cover the other aspect that is core to good White Mage gameplay: effective healing. Instead of seeing damage and thinking, okay, I need to heal that, in general, what you want to be doing is always thinking ahead, like I mentioned earlier. I'm going to split White Mage's heals into 2 categories as we run through them: good heals and emergency heals. Good heals are those that are damage neutral or positive. These are the heals that are your first port of call, the core tools in your arsenal, and you want to make use of them liberally and regularly to keep the party safe. When you're planning your heals, you will generally be using these good heals in the vast majority of these situations. Then you have your emergency heals, which are considered a less than ideal scenario because they'll reduce your damage. But in the words of a great and revered scholar, it is what it is. These heals are powerful and useful, and at times you will rely on them. Understanding when to fall back on them and where their strengths lie is incredibly valuable, and you should not discount them just because you sacrifice damage to cast them. Remember, your first goal is to keep the party alive. Damage is the second one. In terms of your priority heals, for single target scenarios you have Divine Benison and Aqua Veil, which should be used regularly. Benison comes up so often that aside from using them on the tanks to help soak auto attacks and busters, you can additionally put them on non-tank players that may be slightly lower than the rest of the party for an incoming raid hit. Tetragrammaton and Benediction are your single target heals, and whilst in the past many players may have held onto Benediction specifically for tank invulns, you do not need to do that almost at all now. Generally, for all tanks bar warrior, their passive regens or a friendly tetra will help them out of any leftover damage after their invulns. Warrior has such a strong self-healing that usually a tetra or their equilibrium combined will sort them out as well. One thing to bear in mind is that on multi-hit busters with a Dark Knight, you may need to consider a tool for those as well. As a result, you can use Benediction in much more varied situations. For AoE healing, you want to lean heavily on Afflatus Rapture, pairing it with Plenary Indulgence whenever the raid is low and it's available. A Plenary Rapture is just as strong as a Cure 3, but with extended range, instant cast, and no MP cost. So it is a very potent AoE heal, and as we've discussed before, it doesn't cost you damage. Asylum and Temperance are 2 abilities that are both extremely powerful in the right situations and should be used as often as you can whilst retaining their effectiveness. Asylum gives regen ticks to all of those inside the bubble and increases HP recovery via healing actions. This is big, as healing actions refers to all heals, both GCD and OGCD heals, so it will, for example, buff the heal that an Assize provides. You can use it after a raid damage to let the regen slowly top the raid, and allow the tail end of Asylum to catch the shield buffs put up by your co-healer, or you could use it in tandem with a Liturgy to effectively deal with multiple hits. Temperance is a 10% mitigation, but it also increases healing magic potency by 20%. Healing magic refers specifically to GCD healing, so whilst it won't buff your Assize, it will give you a 20% boost onto an Afflatus Rapture. Temperance also allows you to use Divine Caress as a combo action within the next 30 seconds. Comboing as an AoE shield and an AoE regen, this ability is both strong and versatile. You can either stack both Temperance and Divine Caress together for a huge raid wide, or save Divine Caress for a short period of time in order to mitigate subsequent damage, which is especially valuable for multi-hits. Liturgy of the Bell is an insanely good skill. You place it on the floor, and each time you, and specifically you, the White Mage, takes damage, it will proc a 400 potency AoE heal up to 5 times. When it runs out, any remaining stacks will proc and heal for 50% value, which is 200 potency per stack. You can use it for multi-hit raid-wide damages, or when the raid is massively spread out for mechanics thanks to its huge 30 Yalm range, which, considering that most of your AoE GCD heals have a 20 Yalm range, is pretty good, or if you don't have to use it for a long time, for a free big burst heal by manually proccing it. Looking at your emergency heals, Medica 3 is a very strong AoE regen with a small burst heal at the start, and in progression situations you're going to use this a lot. It can be used to top the raid after a hit, or for mechanical dances with major damage spikes. You can use this just before to provide the party a passive regen on top of other heals whilst they practice the mechanic. Cure 3 is your big boy 600 potency AoE heal, but it has a smaller range than every other tool in your library, so it really needs to be saved for situations in which you can ensure a party stat. Regen is generally reserved for tanks or specific mechanics that target one player with heavy repeated damage, but has definitely lost value over time as White Mage has gained more skills. Medica exists, but thanks to Afflatus Rapture, its use cases are more and more becoming few and far between. Cure 2 has the same situation when it comes to single target heals, but one thing I do want to mention individually quickly is Cure. You might say Cure is useless, and in 99% of cases you would be right, but there is one very specific scenario that Cure is good. Cure is a 1.5 second base cast, meaning that the cast goes off faster than a Cure 2 would. If you do not have an Afflatus, or an instant, and no swift cast, and you need to heal one specific player before an incoming damage or they will die, and you're on the last available moment of time before that hit goes out, Cure 1 could just be the play. And in those situations, you'll be happy that you left it a spot on your hotbars. Your aim, and a very important skill as a healer, is being able to remember when the next instance of incoming damage is, and roughly how hard it hits. This allows you to formulate a plan. Let's say there is a roughly 50k raid-wide hit coming in about 10 seconds, and you've checked the party's HP and everyone is above 60k. They're not full HP, so they may benefit from some passive regen from an Asylum, or maybe you have an Assis coming up to bump that number up, but because they will all be surviving the next incoming hit easily, you do not need to be in a rush to use a Rapture or a Medica 3. The party is safe. Bear in mind, there is always a small amount of variance in how hard enemy attacks hit, so always leave a small buffer above what you're expecting, because the last thing you want to do is cause a death due to your misplaced confidence. If the same situation is taking place, a 50k incoming hit, but your party is somewhere in the 30k region, this is a situation in which you'll likely be using a tool like a Plenary Rapture, or a Rapture comboed with a mitigation like Temperance or its combo. You want to use your tools effectively, ideally without overextending and burning everything all at once. There is a fine line to juggle. A cooldown that sits available for extended periods of time is just being wasted. It's doing nothing of value, so it's better to use it than to do nothing at all with it. But it's also not ideal to burn all of your powerful heals at once, leaving you with nothing but GCDs for an upcoming healing section. Balance and foresight is absolutely key to healing well. We'll next talk about how to effectively fulfill the #1 rule of playing FF14 jobs. Always be casting. Most fights have a bunch of different mechanics that either require precise positioning or for you to move a substantial distance in a short space of time. As a job with cast bars, that can be pretty tough to do without dropping casts. So you have a few tools and thought processes at your disposal that you want to ensure you make use of whilst in general play. Firstly, is to plan in advance. Just like you're always looking to the next incoming instance of damage as a healer, you should always be looking to the next mechanic, and what position you'll need to be in for it. If you know you need to move to a specific side of the arena for a left-right cleave, you can pre-position yourself directly in the center, making it easy to dodge no matter what permutation pops up. If you need to head northwest to dodge a future AoE, you can slowly make your way there instead of needing to rush and potentially clipping or losing GCDs along the way. You can do this by making use of slidecasting. If you watch here, you'll see that near the end of each full cast, where there is around 0.75 to 0.5 of a second left on the cast, I'm moving a little bit and then stopping as the cast completes. But my cast is not cancelled by the movement I just made. That's slide casting, and is basically you abusing the game's engine to make small movements during your cast bar. So much of FF14's mechanics revolve around positioning yourself in a certain spot at a certain time. And when you don't have complete freedom of movement, you want to make the most of any window of opportunity possible to get there. This means taking advantage of both instants and slide casts to get yourself from spot to spot without losing uptime. I'd advise practicing this whenever you can, in roulettes, on a dummy, whatever. and get as consistent as you can, because it'll help you a lot. If you want a simple little tip to help you understand when your slidecasting window opens more easily, I find this one very handy in teaching new players. You take an emote and place it somewhere visible on your hotbar and just keep an eye on it while you're casting. You're going to notice that it grays out during the cast, and then lights back up slightly before the cast ends. When it lights up, you can slidecast without cancelling your GCD. This emote on your hotbar is the perfect set of slidecasting training wheels. Use this as a reference point while practicing, and eventually, with comfort, you'll get a feeling for just how early you can slidecast and you won't need to refer to it at all. Healers have half a GCD of movement after every single filler DPS GCD, which is glare in the case of White Mage. This means that if you have a little foresight, you can generally get through all but the fastest movement sections without using any instants for movement, just by inching your way over there in between glares. If both of these fail you, you can opt to burn your instants as movement tools to extend the periods of time with which you can freely run around. Sometimes you can use your natural, or even an early Deer refresh, and a flatters heal, misery, glare 4, or even a swift cast if you have high confidence that you won't need it for a raise. Worst comes to worst, even a regen is an option, because if you're losing damage anyway to move, you might as well get some healing value out of it, right? Consider your options. Do you have enough time to get to your position slowly? If not, what instants do you have that you can use safely to keep your GCD rolling whilst you make those fast movements? White Mage can also use Ethereal Shift to cover long distances quickly. Just bear in mind that you need to watch your spacing and not accidentally fly off the edge, and to use it you'll need weave space regardless. As a healer, you will also be expected to raise. In Duty Finder or Party Finder scenarios, it is safe to assume that the responsibility will fall on you. Whereas in static or while playing with people you already know, it is usually a good idea to make a raise priority plan. As in, decide which healer, or ideally caster, will put out the first res, ensuring nobody accidentally wastes their resources or overlaps. Your aim when raising is to pair it in most cases with Thin Air and Swiftcast. Because it has such a long cast time, hardcasting that spell is a worst case scenario. In a situation that you don't have Swiftcast available and no one else in the party does, if your Swiftcast cooldown is 7 or below, it's honestly even better to just wait for it and then Swift the raise instead. Regarding Thin Air, here are what I believe are your best practices in terms of using it. Unless there is an intense healing phase coming up, leave your Thin Air uncapped, but with 1 stack available for the most part. Your aim is to use your Thin Airs on your highest mana cost spells, so things like Cure 3 or Medica 3 are both fantastic targets for it. If you don't need to use those, just use it on something. Even a glare is fine. The reason you hold onto that second stack is so that you can Thin Air a raise at any moment. The only reason you should spend that second stack on an on-raise is if you are currently having mana issues and need to replenish your NP as soon as possible. Usually when you're coming off a death yourself is when these situations occur. There are exceptions. Like I mentioned a minute ago, if there's, for example, an intense healing check coming up in 20 to 30 seconds and you're about to cap Thin Airs, and you know for a fact that you're going to be expending, say, Cure 3s during it, it's a good idea to let them cap and hold on to them for your moment of need. Using your discretion is very important. This section will give you an introduction into creating a good healing plan for your heals in an encounter. As a note, I'm not really talking about spreadsheeting as such, just how to plan properly, as well as how to efficiently work with your co-healer in 8-man content. Healing on any job effectively is very rarely a case of applying one heal as a solution to the problem of an instance of damage, but instead of thinking about how you can pair and synergize your tools effectively. You always want to be thinking a couple of things. How can I get this ability on cooldown as soon as possible, in a useful way? Where are the maximum value timings for my strongest cooldowns? In the case of White Mage, Temperance and Liturgy of the Bell. Where can I allow my Afflatus to do most of the work whilst not interfering with my burst windows? Is what I'm doing safe and consistent? What's my co-healer doing? Are they putting all their strongest heals in the same place as me, leaving us dry for other parts of the fight? Can I shift something around to fix that? On top of your own tools, it's important to consider what your co-healer has access to, where their strengths and weaknesses lie, and what you're expecting them to use in a given situation. This is actually one of the reasons that many people say to become a better healer, it's valuable to learn other jobs and roles, because this applies to all roles. Seeing what mitigation, support, strengths and weaknesses other roles and jobs have also allows you to more effectively plan out how to utilize them. If as a white mage you're with a sage, you know that if they're playing correctly, they'll be applying Kerachol to mitigate basically every incoming raid wide, which comes with a little passive regen afterwards. You'll also know that if they've used their Numa recently, they don't really have any tools to efficiently brute force top raid HP from low health in the same way that you can with Plenary Rapture, so you should be expected to cover up their weaknesses in that way. Whereas if the scenario is reversed, let's say you have an Astro as your partner. Astro has a very robust OGCD AoE healing kit, and it's likely they'll put down something like an Earthly Star to top the raid, using Collective Unconscious to provide a little mitigation before an incoming hit. Because they can't provide the same level of hit mitigation as a barrier healer can, you might consider providing your Temperance and or Divine Caress for the AoE damage mitigation and shield. In a Pug situation, you can't communicate super effectively, so you often end up overhealing to account for this, or will need to pay a little more attention to the tendencies of your specific co-healer. But when you're both in a group together, it's much easier, because you can form concrete plans from these that will be consistent and easy to remember. If you aren't sure what heals your allies have, that's okay. Bear in mind, your primary responsibility as a pure healer is to put in the majority, but not all, of the work in topping HP bars when passive regens aren't enough, and providing your mitigations for hard sections. I also want to teach you how to be a team player when it comes to actually using your GCD heals. We've discussed emergency heals and how you usually use them when you're running low on tools, or are coming up on a particularly difficult mechanic, or when you fail to plan properly. But there is another situation in which you'll use them. This is when, in doing so, you will gain another player in the party more damage than that which you lose. Your personal damage is less important than the overall group damage, and if you think otherwise, silence, parser. So let me use that same example as before. You're with that Sage co-healer, and you've both exhausted your available free tools and there's a hit coming in. You either need to finish topping the raid via a Medica 3 or a Cure 3, or the Sage will need to use a Eucrasian Prognosis AoE shield. Either of these tools will quote-unquote fix the problem, and put the group in a healthy position for that next hit. They are equally fit for purpose. In this case, you are the person who should do the heal. The group is losing either a Glare or a Dosis, and at level 100, the Dosis does more damage. It's very simple. It's much better to think of these heals in terms of what the group gains or loses, rather than what you yourself gain or lose. After all, damage on boss from the whole party is the only metric that matters for getting the clear. But like I said, it's not just you and your co-healer that can deal with incoming damage. The entire party has mitigation, healing and shielding tools. Warriors can shield and heal the raid with Shake It Off, and lower incoming damage with Reprisal. Monks can increase HP received by healing actions, as well as lowering incoming damage. Every single player in the party has at least something that can be applied to aid in keeping the party alive, and they should be using it. Once again, in Pugs, you just kinda have to see what happens and hope they're playing right, but in a group, you as a healer can help direct traffic in terms of where you'd like extra mitigation by communicating with the people in your group. I don't want to direct you too much with hard rules, because I think the most fun component of healing is creating a plan yourself and seeing it all come together, especially in a progression setting. So my recommendation is to take these pieces of advice and thought processes and then try to apply them yourself, creating something bespoke and feeling rewarded when you do it right. If you have thought of all of these whilst planning mitigation, and you're happy that what you're doing satisfies most, if not all of those criteria we talked about before, then you probably are doing it right. One thing to touch on here is that some healers like to make spreadsheets when planning their heals and mitigation, and if you're trying to play optimally, it can absolutely be a useful thing to do. It's not something I personally make use of most of the time, but should your group want to, it is absolutely an asset worth pursuing. Sometimes, however, things don't go to plan. No matter what situation you're in, be it progression or reclears, you're likely to run into a situation where you either need to come in immediately having received a revive and triage a less than ideal scenario, or recover party deaths from other players to allow the group to continue the pull. Let's talk about how I break these situations down in my head into simple steps and follow them one by one. By doing so, and doing so quickly, you can save so many pulls from immediate failure. I think it's good to get into the habit of trying to save pulls in progression, even if they will result in an enrage later, because recovery is an insanely useful skill to practice, and allowing the group another attempt on problem mechanics further down the line is often valuable. Firstly, think about what comes next. Is it damage to the party, or is it a mechanic? This will guide you as to how you prioritize. If it's a mechanic, check who else is dead. Do you need those guys? No, seriously, think ahead to what's coming up next. The next raid wide, the next tank buster, the next mechanic. Who needs to be alive to correctly resolve it? Get them up immediately. Use your swift cast and thin air, and if you have neither, resort to hard casting if you have to. Then, get at other people that can aid in the recovery process. Healers and other jobs with a raise such as Red Mage and Summoner are top priority, then tanks, then the non-caster DPS last usually. If it's damage, instead of reviving, prioritize healing and mitigating the raid for the incoming hit. That is, assuming that it isn't a split damage that will make you take more with less people alive. Make sure that the party has enough HP to survive the hit, preferably topped, and if one of the dead players is one of the ones that usually places mitigation on that damage, try to provide something a little extra to help supplement the group's safety. As a white mage, that usually means a temperance should it be available, or party regens. You can also use your Aquaveil and Benisons to give tanks or other important players a little extra survivability so that you have a cushion to raise. Then immediately work on getting the reses on. Next up is to check your mana situation. Firstly, can you use Lucid Dreaming? Do you have enough mana to deal with this situation? If you don't, or you aren't sure, Mana Potion if it's available to give yourself an extra 1.8k MP buffer. This is especially important if you've just rezzed. Try to rely on your thin air stacks as much as possible for tools like Raise, Cure 3 or Medica 3, and if you need to stop doing DPS for a short period of time in order to recover, you're going to have to bite the bullet and do it. One thing to understand throughout all of this is what your party is going to be doing to help, and what they can doing to help. Recovery, whilst a heavy burden falls on the healers, is the responsibility of the entire party. Tanks can put their targetable mitigation on players to help out. Paladin can help out with spot healing with a few clutch clemencies. Red Mage and Summoner can help with reses, and players can use their self-sustain whenever possible to make things a little bit easier on the healers. If you're in a recovery scenario as a healer and your Red Mage or Summoner is up, it should be an expectation that they will be working on the reses, so you can focus on triage for the party while they do. If they're dead on the floor, focus them and the other healers so that you have more active reses available. To summarize, in a recovery situation, you want to think, who do I need to res first? How quickly do I need to top the raid? What should I expect the rest of my party to do to help? What excess cooldowns can I dump here to ensure a quick and efficient recovery? How's my MP? In these cases, you often ditch the idea of GCD efficient healing for a handful of seconds because it's the easiest path to getting the group healthy again. But once everybody is up, healthy, and you have 2,000 or 3,000 MP in the bank, you can resume gameplay as normal and hopefully see progression further into the fight. If you yourself have died, you have a few considerations to make. Don't immediately accept res without thinking. If you immediately die after resing, it's almost certainly your own fault. Many new players fall into the trap of instantly taking a raise, instantly trying to heal themselves, and then dying to unavoidable damage. You get the Transcendent buff when you come back up, which, as long as you don't use an action, allows you to be immune to almost every incoming hit in the game for 5 seconds. Use this to immunity an incoming raid damage or mechanic, and then heal yourself on the party afterwards. Note that I said use an action. You can still move safely. I also recommend super ethering as soon as your Transcendent buff drops if you can, making your recovery healing much more lenient and safe. Healers can also use Limit Break 3 to recover runs, and this is an excellent progression or recovery tool. There's not much point in covering nice safe LB3s because they're obvious, but let me give you a fringe use for healer LB that is super valuable. Firstly, if you're one of the last remaining players, actually, the less survivors the better, and a mechanic is coming in that will definitely wipe the raid. Wait until a few seconds before it goes off, and then hit the healer LB to flip the board. Anybody dead will be raised, surviving past the point of that mechanic hitting, and anybody alive at the time, including you, will die. In a situation where, say, 6 were dead and 2 were alive or something similar, this is a big play, and the other healer can quickly res you, and you can proceed to stabilize the run safely. You can use raises in much the same way. accepting a res right before a mechanic resolves, allowing you to avoid its effect and survive past it. This is referred to as res cheesing usually, and it can be incredibly powerful in the right scenarios. In dungeons, healing on White Mage is pretty simple. You want to regen and benison the tank pre-pull, and then once the mobs are packed up, use at least one of your tools such as Asylum, Temperance or Liturgy. Use your OGCDs as filler, and try to build a Flatus Misery between pulls for maximum damage. Remember that Holy, your primary AoE magic, is also secondarily a mitigation as it stuns enemies. Because of this, don't front load your healing too much on White Mage. That pre-pull regen and benison, and likely one other tool, is going to be more than enough all on their own if your tank is using their cooldowns wisely. You have Tetra, Benediction, and more if the tank starts taking heavy hits. Don't be afraid to use your big AoE tools in trash packs. They hit so much harder than bosses that if anything, it's encouraged to burn everything on the trash mobs. One thing of note is that you have access to Glare 4 now, which is an AoE skill every 2 minutes as a combo action of Presence of Mind. What you can do with this is you can use it to stagger out the stuns from your Holy in order to ensure that you gain even more overall duration from it. This is something to consider when you are doing roughly every second trash pack when Presence of Mind should be up. For damage, put Dia on as many mobs as possible while the tank is still pulling and positioning. Then once they're together, either cast or swift cast a Holy. Then weave Presence of Mind or Thin Air if you have them, and proceed to spam Holy after using your Glare 4s. If you have Misery, you definitely want to use that here too. Building 3 lilies up in between packs, then hitting Misery after they group up is so amazing for DPS that it's always your main priority. The stun from the Holy allows you to keep DPSing even longer, and if you stagger it like I mentioned before, you can gain even more value. And if the DPS in the group are proficient, often the tank can avoid even needing a single heal. It's important to note that Dia is technically a damage gain over Holy up to like 6 or 7 targets, as long as the dot ticks for the full duration on all enemies. So if you have a particularly slow dungeon run, it may be worth continuing to apply an extra Dia or 2 even after the mobs have been grouped up. I hope some of these tips were useful. You may have some pieces of knowledge for White Mage of your own that you'd like to contribute. If so, please, I'd love to hear from you in the comments section. I think one thing that is important to say is that you can take in all of this advice, and a lot of it is definitely worth bearing in mind, but there is no substitute for actual practice. The best thing you can possibly do is to bear in mind a few of these sections that seem salient to you, apply them, and practice with them, and then slowly over time expand on the parts of White Mage's gameplay that you aren't too confident in. Play lots of content, hard, easy, and everything in between, and always analyze your performance afterwards. Not from the perspective of did you do good or bad, but from the thought process of taking notes to improve on for the next time. Then in time you will absolutely make a fantastic healer that any party would be glad to have. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.